People like you should stay out of conversations that built billion-dollar companies. The words sliced through the ballroom with the kind of cold precision only powerful men could afford. A few nervous laughs followed. Crystal glasses clinked softly beneath the golden chandeliers of the Marlowe Grand Hotel, while Manhattan shimmered outside the towering windows like a sea of restless diamonds. Claire Bennett lowered her eyes politely, one hand steady beneath the silver coffee tray she carried through the crowded gala. "Of course, sir," she said quietly. Her voice remained calm. Too calm for someone who had just become the center of a billionaire's joke. Ethan Calloway leaned back in his chair with effortless confidence, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal Tom Ford suit as though the moment no longer interested him. At 38, he had the kind of face financial magazines love to place beside headlines about disruption, innovation, and unstoppable ambition. Sharp jawline, steel gray eyes, dark hair touched faintly with silver near the temples. America called him a genius. Wall Street called him dangerous. Tonight, the investors surrounding his private table laughed because Ethan Calloway had laughed first. Claire simply nodded once and reached for the empty espresso cup near his elbow. The ballroom smelled faintly of expensive perfume, polished marble, and rain drifting in from Park Avenue every time the revolving doors opened downstairs. Outside, October thunderclouds rolled slowly above Manhattan, turning the city darker by the minute. Inside, the annual Callaway Technologies Acquisition Gala glittered with old money and new power. Men in tailored suits discussed mergers over 18-year bourbon, while women in silk gowns smiled carefully beside them. Somewhere near the stage, a violin quartet played softly beneath the hum of conversation. Claire moved through the room like she belonged to none of it. Black uniform, white gloves, hair pinned neatly behind her head. Invisible. That was how she preferred it. Invisible people noticed everything. "Another round for the table," one of the investors said, barely looking at her. "Yes, sir." Claire reached for the bottle of sparkling water beside Ethan's plate when another voice interrupted. "Careful," Ethan murmured without looking up from the digital presentation glowing on the tablet in front of him. "That information is probably worth more than your yearly salary." More laughter. Softer this time. Claire's fingers paused only briefly against the chilled glass bottle. Then she poured the water smoothly into the investor's crystal tumbler without spilling a drop. Ethan finally glanced up. For a brief second, his expression shifted. Something about the waitress unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the silence. Most people either laughed too hard around him or became visibly nervous. Claire Bennett did neither. Her face remained composed, though her pale blue eyes held an unreadable stillness that made him strangely aware of himself. "You disagree with something?" Ethan asked casually. Several executives turned toward her immediately. Claire looked up slowly. "No, sir." "You hesitated." "I was concentrating on not spilling the water." A few guests smirked quietly. Ethan's mouth curved faintly, though not warmly. "Good answer." Claire stepped back from the table, ready to leave, when a voice near the projector screen spoke in Japanese. One of the overseas investors had been quietly studying a financial graph projected behind the stage. He pointed toward a line of cybersecurity projections and frowned. Ethan immediately stood, confidence returning to his posture like armor sliding back into place. "Gentlemen," he announced smoothly, "what you're seeing here is the future of secure AI infrastructure. Callaway Technologies survived attacks that would have destroyed weaker companies because we built systems designed to adapt faster than threats themselves." Applause followed politely. Claire froze. Not visibly, just enough for the tray in her hand to tighten slightly beneath her fingers. Her eyes drifted toward the presentation screen. Project Aegis. The name alone made her chest tighten. 7 years. 7 years since she had last seen those words glowing across a monitor in a dark office downtown. Ethan continued speaking confidently while images shifted behind him. Growth charts. Security architecture. Market projections. The audience watched him the way people watched skyscrapers rise, impressed by the illusion of permanence. But Claire wasn't looking at Ethan anymore. She was staring at a tiny detail near the bottom corner of the presentation slide. A timestamp. October 14th, 11:42 p.m. Her breathing slowed. The room suddenly felt colder. Because she remembered exactly what happened at 11:42 p.m. 7 years ago. She remembered alarms flashing red across computer monitors. She remembered encrypted files disappearing in real time. She remembered someone inside the company trying to erase everything before federal investigators arrived. And she remembered staying behind alone while everyone else ran. "Miss?" one investor asked. Claire blinked softly, returning to the present. "Coffee refill." She nodded immediately and stepped forward again, her movements graceful despite the storm now building quietly inside her chest. Ethan resumed, charming the room effortlessly. "Success," he said, lifting his whiskey glass slightly, "belongs to people willing to do what others are afraid of." More applause followed. Claire poured fresh coffee beside him. The scent drifted upward between them. Dark roast. Bitter. Familiar. Ethan glanced sideways at her again. "You know," he said lightly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "I almost feel bad discussing billion-dollar cybersecurity systems around someone who probably still uses the same phone for 5 years." The table erupted again. Claire lowered the coffee pot carefully onto the tray. Then, for the first time that evening, she looked directly into Ethan Calloway's eyes. Calm, unshaken, almost sad. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the people nobody notices are the only reason those systems survived at all." Silence flickered across the table for half a second. Tiny, barely there. Then someone laughed awkwardly, breaking the tension before it could settle. Ethan studied her face more carefully now. There was no anger in her expression. No embarrassment either. Just certainty. And somehow, that unsettled him far more than outrage would have. Claire stepped away from the table before anyone could respond. Her black shoes moved quietly across the marble floor, while thunder rumbled somewhere far above the city. Behind her, Ethan continued speaking to investors. Confident, untouchable, unaware that the quiet waitress carrying coffee through his gala knew exactly which secret his empire had been built upon. The rain started just after 10 o'clock. Thin at first, then heavier, sliding down the glass walls of the Marlowe Grand Hotel in silver streams that blurred the Manhattan skyline into smears of gold and gray. Inside the service hallway behind the ballroom, Claire Bennett stood alone beside a stainless steel counter, her breathing controlled but shallow. The sounds of the gala reached her through the swinging kitchen doors in softened waves. Laughter, music, crystal glasses touching gently somewhere far away. She closed her eyes for a moment and tightened her grip around the paper cup in her hand. Project Aegis. 7 years, and she still could not hear those words without remembering the sound of alarms. Claire. She opened her eyes immediately. Daniel, one of the younger servers, leaned against the doorway carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes. "You okay?" "Fine. You do not look fine." He gave a small nervous smile. "Honestly, I thought Mr. Billionaire was about 2 seconds away from firing everyone in the room." Claire exhaled softly. Men like that do not fire people themselves. Daniel laughed under his breath, though Claire did not. She glanced toward the ballroom entrance again. Even from here, she could hear Ethan Calloway's voice carrying smoothly across the room like polished steel. Confident, controlled, untouchable. Daniel lowered his voice. "Seriously though, how did you know what he was talking about earlier?" Claire looked down at the coffee cup. "About what?" "The system thing." He stepped closer. "You corrected him before he even finished answering." "I did not correct him." "Claire." Daniel raised an eyebrow. Everyone at that table noticed. She remained silent. That was answer enough. Somewhere down the hall, a dishwasher rattled loudly. Kitchen staff moved quickly beneath fluorescent lights, while waiters rushed in and out carrying trays worth more than a month of rent. Claire had worked enough places like this to understand how invisible service workers became to wealthy people. Guests rarely remembered faces. They remembered wine labels, valet times, whether the steak arrived hot enough. Invisible people heard everything. That was dangerous sometimes. Claire set the untouched coffee beside the sink. Her navy notebook rested near her folded jacket at the end of the counter. Old, worn at the edges. She reached for it carefully, almost instinctively. Daniel noticed immediately. "You write in that thing every night." "Sometimes." "Poetry." Claire smiled faintly for the first time all evening. Not even close. Before he could ask another question, the kitchen doors burst open. "Where is table 12's bourbon?" The floor manager snapped while hurrying past them. "And somebody get back out there. Calloway's investors are asking for dessert menus." Daniel groaned quietly and grabbed another tray. "Welcome to paradise." Claire tucked the notebook into her bag before anyone else could see it, but not before one folded photograph slipped loose and fell lightly onto the counter. Daniel picked it up automatically. Sorry. Then he paused. The expression on his face changed. Wait, is that you? Claire reached for the picture too quickly. Too late. Daniel had already seen enough. A younger Claire stared back from the faded photograph. Different haircut, different clothes. Standing inside what looked like a technology conference room beside rows of computer monitors. Around her neck hung an identification badge with the Callaway Technologies logo clearly visible. Daniel looked stunned. You work there? Claire slipped the photograph back into the notebook carefully. A long time ago. Doing what? Intern work. That is not intern work. He pointed toward the picture. Those are server racks. Claire zipped the bag closed. People end up in different places. Daniel stared at her another second before slowly nodding. He understood enough to stop asking questions. Outside the kitchen doors, applause suddenly erupted through the ballroom again. Ethan must have finished another speech. Claire felt the sound settle heavily in her chest. 7 years ago, she would have applauded too. Back then, Ethan Callaway had still been the young founder every tech student admired. Brilliant. Relentless. The man who promised to change digital security forever. She remembered believing him. She remembered believing all of them. Claire. The floor manager appeared again, already irritated. You are needed back inside. Yes, ma'am. And try not to upset the guests this time. Claire nodded once and grabbed her tray. The ballroom looked even brighter when she stepped back inside. Candlelight flickered across marble columns while servers floated silently between tables carrying whiskey, lobster risotto, and $1,000 bottles of wine. Near the stage, Ethan stood surrounded by investors and reporters. He looked completely at ease beneath the spotlight, like a man born for admiration. But Claire noticed something others did not. His left hand kept adjusting the silver watch near his cuff every few seconds. Small movement, almost unconscious. Nervous habit. She remembered that too. Ethan laughed at something one of the investors said, but his eyes drifted briefly across the room again. Searching. Then they landed on her. Claire stopped walking for half a second. Across the ballroom, their eyes locked once more. This time Ethan did not smile. He studied her carefully instead, as though trying to solve a problem that suddenly refused to stay simple. Claire looked away first and continued toward another table. Her posture remained graceful, professional, calm. But inside, memories were beginning to wake like ghosts beneath deep water. Because Ethan Callaway still had no idea who she was. And worse than that, he still had no idea what really happened the night his company almost disappeared forever. By 11:30, the storm had swallowed most of Manhattan. Rain hammered against the towering windows of the Marlowe Grand Hotel, while flashes of distant lightning turned the ballroom silver for brief, ghostly seconds at a time. Inside, the gala continued untouched by the weather outside. Wealth had a way of pretending storms belonged to other people. Claire Bennett moved quietly between tables carrying fresh drinks while conversations about billion-dollar acquisitions floated through the air around her like smoke. The orchestra near the stage had shifted into slower music now. Softer, more expensive somehow. Investors leaned closer over crystal glasses while reporters circled Ethan Callaway like satellites orbiting a private sun. Mr. Callaway, is it true the Tokyo merger will make your cybersecurity division the largest private defense network in North America? A journalist asked. Ethan adjusted his cuff calmly before answering. We are not interested in being the largest, he said smoothly. We are interested in being impossible to replace. Several people nodded immediately, impressed by the confidence in his voice. Claire watched from across the room while setting down a tray of champagne flutes near the dessert station. Ethan always knew exactly what to say. That had been true even before the money, before the magazine covers, before politicians started shaking his hand like they needed his approval to breathe. 7 years ago, Ethan had been different in smaller ways. Less polished, more restless. But even back then, people listened when he spoke. Claire remembered that clearly. She also remembered the exhaustion hidden behind his ambition. The nights he slept inside the office. The coffee stains on engineering reports. The pressure in his eyes whenever investors demanded impossible deadlines. She remembered all of it because she had been there. You were staring again. Claire turned quickly. Olivia, another waitress, stood beside her carrying a tray of miniature cheesecakes. I am working. Olivia smirked softly. You have barely blinked in 5 minutes. Claire looked away from Ethan immediately. Do you ever feel strange serving people who spend more on dinner than most families make in a month? Olivia shrugged. Every night. And it never bothers you. Honestly, Olivia glanced around carefully before lowering her voice. Sometimes I think rich people are just scared in more expensive clothes. Claire almost smiled at that. Almost. Near the center table, Ethan shook hands with a silver-haired investor while cameras flashed around them. The giant screen behind the stage displayed another presentation slide filled with security infrastructure models and encrypted data flow maps. Most guests saw success. Claire saw mistakes. Tiny ones. Hidden in plain sight. One line of code displayed incorrectly near the lower corner. An outdated security layer. Ethan probably did not even notice. But Claire did. She noticed because she had helped design the original framework years ago before everything collapsed. Miss Bennett. Claire stiffened immediately at the sound of the voice behind her. She turned to find Richard Vale standing near the service entrance. Older. Expensive suit. Cold blue eyes sharpened by decades inside corporate boardrooms. Claire felt the blood leave her face so quickly she almost dropped the tray in her hands. Richard Vale smiled politely. The kind of smile powerful men practiced in mirrors. It has been a long time. Claire forced herself to remain calm. Good evening, sir. Olivia glanced between them, confused by the sudden tension. You two know each other? Old colleagues. Richard answered smoothly before Claire could speak. Very old. Olivia excused herself almost immediately, sensing something uncomfortable beneath the conversation. Richard waited until she disappeared before stepping closer. I almost did not recognize you. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the tray. I recognized you immediately. Still sharp, his eyes moved across her waitress uniform slowly. Though life clearly took some unexpected turns. Claire said nothing. Richard glanced toward Ethan across the ballroom. Interesting place for a reunion, is it not? I work here. No, Richard's voice remained calm. You hide here. A flash of lightning illuminated the ballroom windows behind them. For 1 second, the room turned pale white. Claire kept her expression neutral, though her heartbeat had started climbing painfully inside her chest. Richard Vale had been chief operations officer during the Aegis scandal. The man who controlled internal investigations. The man who signed termination papers. The man who erased names. Does Ethan know? Richard asked quietly. Claire looked directly at him now. Know what? Who saved his company? Silence stretched between them. Heavy. Dangerous. Richard adjusted the sleeve of his tailored coat. You should have stayed gone, Claire. I never planned to come back. Then why are you here? Claire glanced toward Ethan again. He stood beneath golden light near the center stage while guests surrounded him with admiration. Untouchable. Unaware. I did not come for him, she said softly. Richard studied her face carefully, searching for something. Anger maybe. Revenge. But Claire's expression remained painfully calm. That unsettled him more than hostility would have. People buried that story for a reason, he said at last. Sometimes buried things survive anyway. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Before he could answer, movement near the stage interrupted them. One of the giant presentation screens flickered suddenly. Just once. Most guests did not notice. Ethan did. His eyes snapped toward the screen immediately. So did Claire's. The image stabilized again after half a second, but Claire already knew what caused it. A synchronization delay inside the older backup server. The exact same flaw they failed to patch 7 years ago. Ethan frowned slightly, while one of the technicians hurried toward the stage controls. Richard noticed Claire watching the screen. You still remember the system. Some things are difficult to forget. Another flicker crossed the screen. Longer this time. Guests began murmuring quietly. Ethan's expression hardened beneath the stage lights while technicians whispered nervously near the control station. Claire inhaled slowly, because she recognized the warning signs instantly. And deep down, she already knew exactly what was about to happen. The third flicker lasted long enough for the music to stop. Conversations collapsed across the ballroom in uneven waves while the giant presentation screen behind the stage flashed black for 2 full seconds before returning again. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. Several reporters immediately lifted their phones. Ethan Calloway remained perfectly still beneath the chandeliers, though the tightness near his jaw betrayed him. Ladies and gentlemen, he said smoothly into the microphone. It appears our system is struggling with the weather outside more than we are. Polite laughter scattered through the room, but the tension remained. Near the stage, two technicians worked frantically at the control panel while another spoke urgently into a headset. Claire Bennett watched from across the ballroom with growing concern. Not fear. Recognition. The synchronization delay was spreading faster now. That meant the backup architecture was failing to reroute properly, which meant somebody never fixed the original vulnerability. Her stomach tightened. 7 years, and they still built the system on unstable foundations. Why are they panicking? Olivia whispered beside her while pretending to arrange dessert plates. Claire kept her eyes on the flickering screen. Because they do not understand the problem yet. Another flicker. Longer this time. A graph disappeared entirely before reappearing distorted across the screen in broken fragments. Murmurs spread louder through the crowd now. Ethan stepped away from the microphone and approached the technicians directly. Claire could not hear his words from across the room, but she recognized the look in his eyes immediately. Controlled frustration. The same expression he wore during crisis meetings years ago. One technician shook his head nervously while pointing toward the server feed. Ethan's posture stiffened. Can they fix it? Olivia asked quietly. Claire did not answer right away, because she already knew they could not. Not quickly enough, and not before the investors noticed something was seriously wrong. Richard Vale appeared beside Ethan near the stage now, speaking low enough to avoid attention. Even from a distance, Claire saw the tension between them instantly. Ethan looked irritated. Richard looked worried. That alone frightened her more than the failing system. Richard Vale never worried unless the consequences were expensive. Another lightning flash illuminated the ballroom windows. Thunder followed seconds later, deeper now. Closer. The presentation screen suddenly glitched again, but this time the image did not return correctly. Instead, rows of encrypted server logs flashed briefly across the massive display before disappearing again into static. The room fell silent. Claire's pulse stopped cold. Those logs should not have existed anymore. Ethan turned sharply toward the technicians. Take it offline now. We are trying, sir. Then try faster. The microphone near the podium accidentally picked up his voice this time. Several investors exchanged uncomfortable looks. Reporters started recording openly now. Claire moved instinctively toward the stage before stopping herself halfway across the ballroom. No, she could not get involved. Not again. Miss Bennett. Claire froze. Ethan's voice carried across the room unexpectedly. Calm. Sharp. Directly at her. Every nearby guest turned immediately. Ethan stood near the failing screen with one hand braced against the presentation table. You seem very interested in our system tonight. Claire felt dozens of eyes settle onto her at once. I'm just doing my job, sir. Really? Ethan gestured lightly toward the glitching screen behind him. Because you looked remarkably confident earlier for someone serving coffee. A few awkward laughs followed from the surrounding tables, though weaker now. The tension in the room had changed. Claire remained perfectly still. I apologize if I gave that impression. No apology necessary. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. I simply find it fascinating when people pretend to understand things they clearly do not. Silence. Olivia looked horrified beside her. Richard Vale watched from near the stage without speaking. Claire should have walked away then. That would have been safer. Easier. Invisible people survived longer. But another violent glitch tore across the presentation screen behind Ethan, and this time the entire system locked completely. The ballroom lights dimmed briefly before stabilizing again. Guests gasped softly. Somewhere near the back of the room, a wine glass shattered against marble. Ethan turned toward the technicians again. Why is the backup server not compensating? No answer came quickly enough. Claire closed her eyes for half a second. Then she spoke before she could stop herself. Because the backup loop is trapped in recursive authentication. The room went still. Completely still. One of the technicians looked up immediately. What? Claire stepped forward slowly now, setting her tray down onto a nearby table. The synchronization protocol is rejecting mirrored credentials faster than the server can rebuild them. Ethan stared at her. Excuse me. Claire's voice remained soft. Professional. Calm. The storm disrupted the external timing verification. Your backup system is authenticating itself repeatedly instead of rerouting the signal. One of the younger engineers near the stage blinked in shock. That is, he stopped himself. That is actually possible. Ethan's eyes narrowed dangerously. And how exactly would a waitress know that? Claire hesitated. The entire ballroom seemed to lean toward her, waiting for the answer. But before she could speak, the screen behind Ethan suddenly flashed again. This time, a hidden internal file opened accidentally across the massive display. Project Aegis Recovery Protocol. Claire's blood ran cold. Richard Vale moved instantly toward the control station. Shut it down. Too late. One line remained visible across the giant screen before the system blacked out completely. Initial security breach contained by C.B. The silence afterward felt enormous. Ethan slowly turned toward Claire again. No arrogance now. No amusement either. Just confusion. Sharp and immediate. Who? He asked quietly. Is C.B.? Claire looked at the dark screen. Then at Ethan. Outside, thunder rolled over Manhattan like distant warning bells while rain poured harder against the glass walls surrounding the ballroom. And for the first time all night, Ethan Calloway no longer looked like the most powerful person in the room. No one moved for several seconds. The ballroom stood frozen beneath the dim chandelier light, while rain battered the windows high above Manhattan. Initial security breach contained by C.B. The words had vanished from the screen almost immediately, but the damage was already done. Investors stared at one another in confusion. Reporters lowered their phones slowly, sensing something far more important than a technical malfunction unfolding in real time. Ethan Calloway kept his eyes fixed on Claire Bennett. The confidence that normally defined him had shifted into something sharper now. Suspicion, curiosity, unease. Answer the question, he said quietly. Claire could feel every gaze in the room pressing against her at once. It does not matter. It clearly matters. Ethan stepped down from the stage slowly. Who is C.B.? Richard Vale moved quickly between them before Claire could answer. This is obviously some kind of old archived system error, he interrupted smoothly. The guests do not need to concern themselves with outdated internal data. But Ethan did not look at Richard. His attention remained locked on Claire. You knew exactly how the server failed. Claire remained still. I recognized the pattern. From where? Another flicker crossed the ballroom lights. The technicians were still struggling near the control station, though quieter now. Nervous. One of them whispered something to another while glancing repeatedly toward Claire. Ethan noticed that too. Everyone out. Richard suddenly ordered the technical team in a low, controlled voice. Now. They hesitated only briefly before obeying. That frightened Claire more than anything else tonight. Richard never removed witnesses unless the situation had become dangerous. Ethan finally broke eye contact long enough to glance toward the crowd surrounding them. He understood what was happening immediately. Reporters watching. Investors whispering. Questions spreading. Public embarrassment. He straightened his posture instantly. The billionaire mask returned with practiced precision. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced calmly. It appears our system inherited a little drama from our older servers. Please enjoy the rest of the evening while we sort out a technical inconvenience. Some guests relaxed slightly at the confidence in his tone. Others clearly did not. But money had a strange effect on people. If a billionaire acted calm enough, most people convinced themselves everything was under control. Claire turned quietly toward the service hallway, hoping to disappear before Ethan stopped her again. Miss Bennett. She froze. You are not leaving. His voice remained polite, which somehow felt worse. Claire turned back slowly. I still have tables to serve. Not tonight. Richard stepped closer immediately. Ethan, this is unnecessary. No, Ethan's eyes never left Claire's face. I think this has become very necessary. The ballroom lights dimmed once more before stabilizing again. Somewhere outside, sirens echoed faintly through the rain-soaked streets below. Claire inhaled slowly. This was exactly what she had spent 7 years avoiding. Attention. Questions. People digging through buried things. Sir, she said carefully, whatever happened tonight was an old system problem. That is all. You recognize proprietary architecture from 7 years ago after looking at it for 5 seconds. Ethan folded his arms. That is not normal waitress behavior. Several nearby investors shifted awkwardly at the remark. Ethan noticed too late. Claire's expression did not change, but something quiet settled behind her eyes. Not anger. Disappointment. You keep saying waitress like it explains intelligence, she said softly. Silence. One investor looked down at his drink immediately. Another pretended to check his phone. Ethan's jaw tightened. For the first time all evening, he looked unsure of his next sentence. Richard stepped in smoothly before the silence could deepen further. Claire used to intern briefly with one of our early development teams. Ethan turned sharply toward him. You knew her? Years ago. And you failed to mention that. Richard's expression remained calm. Because it was irrelevant. Claire almost laughed at the word. Irrelevant. That was how powerful people buried lives. One clean word at a time. Ethan looked between them now, piecing things together rapidly. You worked on Aegis. It was not a question anymore. Claire remained silent. How much did you work on? Ethan pressed. Enough to recognize bad architecture. One of the investors coughed awkwardly into his glass. Richard stepped closer toward Claire, lowering his voice. This is not the place. No, Claire answered quietly. It never was. Ethan noticed the exchange immediately. What does that mean? Claire glanced toward the dark presentation screen behind him. Reflections of chandelier light shimmered faintly across the black surface like fractured memories. It means some people spent years building systems they never received credit for. Richard's face hardened instantly. Careful. Claire finally looked directly at him now. Calm. Fearless. I was careful for 7 years. Ethan stared at her in stunned silence. Outside, thunder rolled across the city again. The rain had become relentless now, hammering against the glass walls hard enough to sound almost like static. Olivia appeared cautiously near the dessert station, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. So did several servers. Staff members always sensed when powerful people began losing control. Ethan walked slowly toward the dark presentation screen. His reflection stared back at him from the black surface. Billionaire founder. Magazine cover genius. Architect of a $14 billion empire. But now there was something else in his expression too. Doubt. Richard, he said quietly without turning around. What exactly happened 7 years ago? Richard answered too quickly. A contained internal breach. That is the press version. Ethan finally turned back toward him. I asked what actually happened. Richard hesitated. Tiny pause. But enough. Claire saw it immediately. So did Ethan. And suddenly, for the first time all night, the billionaire no longer looked irritated by the waitress standing in front of him. He looked afraid of what she might say next. The ballroom no longer sounded like a celebration. The music had stopped completely now, replaced by low whispers drifting beneath the chandeliers like nervous static. Rain continued hammering against the towering windows, while flashes of lightning rolled across the Manhattan skyline outside. Claire Bennett stood near the dark presentation screen with her hands folded calmly in front of her, though her heartbeat felt painfully loud inside her chest. Across from her, Ethan Calloway looked nothing like the untouchable billionaire from earlier tonight. The confidence was still there, but cracked now, disturbed by something he could not control. I asked you a question, Ethan said quietly to Richard Vale. Richard adjusted his cufflinks with practiced calm. And I answered. No, Ethan shook his head slowly. You gave me a press statement. Silence settled heavily between them. Several investors had already drifted toward the exits, sensing trouble far beyond a technical issue. Others remained frozen near their tables, pretending not to watch while listening to every word. Claire noticed reporters trying discreetly to record the conversation from across the ballroom. Richard noticed too. This discussion should happen privately, he said firmly. Then stop hiding it publicly, Claire answered before Ethan could speak. Richard turned toward her immediately. You have no idea what damage you are causing. Claire almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. Powerful people always called the truth dangerous after they lost control of it. Ethan looked between them again. What damage? Richard exhaled slowly, already calculating. 7 years ago, Callaway Technologies experienced an internal security event during early development. I know that part. Ethan's voice sharpened. I lived through it. Not all of it. Richard's eyes flicked briefly toward Claire before returning to Ethan. There were confidential decisions made to protect the company. Claire's fingers tightened slightly together. There it was. Protect the company. Another clean phrase used to bury real people beneath corporate survival. Ethan stared at Richard carefully now. Confidential decisions involving her? Richard hesitated. Tiny pause again. Enough to answer everything. Claire looked away toward the rain-streaked windows. She remembered that night too clearly. 22 years old. Sitting alone in a freezing server room while warning alerts flashed across every monitor. Half the security team gone home already. Executives unreachable. Someone inside the company deleting financial records connected to illegal offshore accounts before regulators arrived the next morning. She had stayed because nobody else noticed what was happening fast enough. She stayed because she believed saving the company mattered more than protecting herself. Claire. Ethan's voice interrupted the memory gently this time. Different now. Less arrogant. What happened? The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Claire looked at him slowly. For the first time all evening, she saw no mockery in his expression. Only confusion. Genuine confusion. Which somehow hurt more. The company was breached from inside, she said quietly. Not outside. Ethan frowned immediately. That is impossible. No, Claire shook her head once. Just expensive to hide. Richard stepped forward sharply. That is enough. Claire ignored him completely. Someone inside your executive division was moving restricted financial data through the backup servers. Ethan stared at her. Who? Claire looked directly at Richard. The silence afterward felt massive. Richard's expression barely changed, but the color drained slightly from his face. Ethan noticed immediately. Richard, be careful what you imply, Richard said coldly toward Claire. I am not implying anything. Her voice remained calm. I am remembering it. Another flash of lightning illuminated the ballroom. Olivia stood near the service entrance with both hands covering her mouth now. Even the hotel staff had stopped pretending not to listen. Ethan looked between Claire and Richard again, trying to process years of carefully constructed history collapsing in front of him in real time. You were saying she stopped the breach? Richard answered first. She was an intern. That is not what I asked. Ethan's voice hardened instantly. Richard remained silent. Claire finally spoke instead. I found the transfer pattern after midnight. Her eyes drifted toward the dark screen behind them. The system kept rerouting encrypted files through backup authentication loops. Somebody thought it would look like normal server instability. Ethan listened without interrupting. I shut down the external transfer manually, Claire continued softly. Then I isolated the corrupted nodes before federal investigators detected the breach. One of the investors near the back whispered under his breath, stunned. Ethan stared at Claire as though seeing her for the first time. Why was none of this ever reported? Richard answered immediately. Because the company survived. Claire closed her eyes briefly. There it was again. Survival. Always the company first. Always the people last. Ethan slowly turned toward Richard now. What happened to her afterward? Richard's silence lasted too long. Claire answered for him. My access disappeared the next morning. Ethan looked back at her sharply. What? My employee credentials stopped working. Security escorted me out before noon. Her voice remained painfully calm. By Friday, the official report blamed procedural negligence from junior development staff. Olivia gasped quietly near the doorway. Ethan's expression darkened completely now. You blamed her. Richard lifted his chin slightly. The board needed accountability. Claire laughed softly before she could stop herself. Not bitter, just tired. That was the first time I learned corporations and truth are not always the same thing. Ethan looked shaken now, deeply shaken. His hand moved unconsciously toward the silver watch near his cuff again. Nervous habit. Claire remembered it well. Why did you never contact me? He asked quietly. Claire met his eyes. Would you have listened? Ethan opened his mouth, then stopped, because both of them already knew the answer. The silence between them felt heavier than the storm outside. Ethan Calloway stood motionless beneath the chandelier light, while Claire Bennett's final question lingered in the ballroom like smoke. Would you have listened? He already knew the answer. 7 years ago, he had been too busy building an empire to notice who was bleeding beneath the foundation. Rain slid endlessly down the massive glass windows surrounding the ballroom. Manhattan glowed beyond them in blurred streaks of white and gold. Inside, nobody touched their drinks anymore. Nobody cared about the merger. The gala had stopped being a celebration nearly 20 minutes ago. Now it felt like a courtroom without a judge. Ethan finally looked away from Claire and turned toward Richard Vale again. Tell me she is wrong. Richard remained composed, but only barely. Ethan, this is not the time for emotional reactions. Tell me she is wrong. Louder this time. Sharper. Richard exhaled slowly. The company was under extraordinary pressure back then. That is not an answer. Claire watched Ethan carefully now. For the first time all night, he no longer looked like a man trying to protect his image. He looked like someone trying to understand his own history. Richard folded his hands calmly in front of him. The board believed containing the scandal quickly was the only way to save the company. So you blamed an intern. We protected thousands of employees from losing their jobs. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. There it was again. Numbers over names. Profit over people. Ethan stared at Richard in disbelief. You let her take the fall for internal corruption? She signed the containment authorization herself. Ethan turned sharply toward Claire. You signed something? Claire nodded once. I signed a non-disclosure agreement after they promised the investigation would remain internal. And then my career disappeared. Her voice stayed calm, though softer now. Universities stopped returning my calls. Internship offers vanished. Every recommendation connected to the company was erased within a week. Olivia covered her mouth near the service station. Even some of the investors looked uncomfortable now. Richard's expression hardened. You are leaving out important details. Claire looked directly at him. Am I? Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice carefully. You were warned not to interfere with executive matters. Ethan frowned immediately. Interfere? Richard hesitated. Wrong move. Ethan noticed instantly. What executive matters? Claire answered before Richard could. Financial laundering. Several people gasped quietly nearby. Richard's jaw tightened. That accusation was never proven. Because the evidence vanished. Claire's voice remained steady, along with the servers. Ethan stared at Richard now with open disbelief. Tell me she is lying. Richard did not answer fast enough. The storm outside cracked violently with thunder that rattled the ballroom windows hard enough to make several guests jump. Claire closed her eyes briefly at the sound. She remembered another storm 7 years ago. Another night filled with alarms and panic and fluorescent lights reflecting off cold server room floors. She remembered calling supervisors who never answered. She remembered staying until sunrise while encrypted files disappeared one by one across the monitors. And she remembered Ethan arriving hours later after the crisis had already ended. Exhausted, confused, thanking the executive team for saving the company while she stood invisible near the back wall holding a stack of corrupted hard drives no one ever asked about. You never knew, Claire said quietly. Ethan looked at her immediately. Knew what? That your company survived because the wrong people took credit. The words landed softly, but they hit harder than shouting ever could. Ethan's hand moved unconsciously to the silver watch again. Nervous habit. Claire remembered teasing him about it once during a late-night coding session years ago. He used to tap the watch whenever systems crashed. He had laughed back then. Strange how memory survived even after trust died. Ethan stared at her carefully now, searching through fragments of recognition buried beneath 7 years of success and noise. Have we met before tonight? Claire hesitated. Tiny pause. Then she reached slowly into the pocket of her uniform apron and removed the old folded photograph from her notebook. Without speaking, she handed it to him. Ethan unfolded it carefully beneath the ballroom lights. His expression changed instantly. In the faded picture, a younger version of himself stood beside a crowded development team inside the original Callaway Technologies office. Coffee cups everywhere. Whiteboards covered in code. Sleepless faces smiling at the camera. And near the back corner stood Claire Bennett wearing an oversized company hoodie and holding a laptop against her chest. 22 years old. Invisible even then. Ethan stared at the photograph in stunned silence. You were there, he whispered. Claire nodded once. Every night. Richard's face darkened immediately. This has gone far enough. No, Ethan looked up slowly. Not even close. The billionaire's voice had changed now. Colder. More dangerous than before. Not because he was angry at Claire. Because he was beginning to understand how much had been hidden from him. You told me the breach was handled by senior security analysts, he said to Richard. It was. You told me the junior team was responsible for the instability. Richard remained silent. Ethan looked back down at the photograph again. Claire standing quietly in the corner while everyone else occupied the center. Somehow that image hurt more than the accusations. Because suddenly he realized something terrible. She had always been there. Working. Fixing problems. Staying invisible while louder people collected recognition around her. And he had never once noticed. Claire watched the realization settle across his face slowly. Painfully. She did not feel satisfaction. Only exhaustion. Why come back now? Ethan asked quietly. Claire looked toward the rain beyond the ballroom windows. I did not come back. Her eyes drifted to the dead presentation screen behind him. Your system never stopped following me. The ballroom felt smaller now. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of shrinking that happened when truth entered a room too expensive to hold it comfortably. Rain continued sliding down the glass walls in silver streaks while the city lights outside trembled beneath the storm. Claire Bennett stood quietly near the edge of the dark presentation stage, her black waitress uniform still perfectly neat despite the chaos surrounding her. Across from her, Ethan Calloway remained frozen with the old photograph still in his hands. He stared at the younger version of himself smiling beside people whose names he barely remembered anymore. But now one face refused to disappear from his mind. Claire, quiet, tired, standing near the back with a laptop pressed against her chest while everyone else celebrated around her. Invisible. You stayed after the breach, Ethan said softly, almost to himself. Claire nodded once. Someone had to. Ethan looked back up at her slowly. Why did nobody tell me? Richard Vale answered before she could. Because you were preparing for emergency investor meetings while the legal department handled the fallout. Ethan turned sharply toward him. Handled. The company survived. Richard's voice remained controlled, though tighter now. That was the priority. Ethan laughed once under his breath. Short. Disbelieving. You keep saying that like it excuses everything. No one answered. Somewhere near the ballroom entrance, hotel staff quietly began clearing untouched dessert trays while pretending not to watch the confrontation unfolding near the stage. Olivia stood completely still near the service station, eyes wide with disbelief. The younger engineers looked shaken too, like students discovering their textbooks lied. Ethan finally folded the photograph carefully and slid it into his suit pocket instead of giving it back immediately. The gesture caught Claire off guard more than she expected. I want access to the archived investigation files, he said suddenly. Richard stiffened. Tonight. That material is sealed. I own the company. The board sealed those records under attorney protection. Ethan stepped closer now, his voice colder than before. Then unlocked them. Lightning flashed violently outside, illuminating the ballroom in pale white light for half a second. Richard's face hardened completely. You are letting emotion cloud your judgment. No, Ethan's eyes locked onto his. I think for the first time in years I am seeing clearly. Silence followed. Heavy. Final. Richard looked toward Claire again, and this time there was no politeness left in his expression. Only calculation. You should understand something, he said quietly to her. If this becomes public, it will not only damage executives. Thousands of employees depend on this company. Claire met his gaze calmly. I know. Do you? Richard stepped closer. Stock collapse. Lawsuits. Federal audits. Pension losses. Entire departments eliminated. Enough. Ethan's voice cut through the ballroom sharply. Richard stopped speaking immediately. Ethan looked exhausted suddenly. Not physically. Spiritually. Like a man discovering the ground beneath his life had never been stable to begin with. He loosened his tie slightly, eyes drifting toward the rain beyond the windows. Do you know what the worst part is? He asked quietly without looking at either of them. Nobody answered. Ethan finally looked back at Claire. I remember that week. His voice softened. I remember everyone telling me the company survived because leadership stayed calm under pressure. Claire remained silent. I remember thanking the executive team personally. He gave a hollow smile. I even remember sending bonuses. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Ethan noticed. But I do not remember anyone mentioning the intern who stayed overnight, saving corrupted servers while executives protected themselves. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Most people do not remember the quiet ones. The words hit Ethan harder than she intended, because suddenly he realized something else. The waitress standing in front of him had not interrupted the gala for revenge. She had not exposed him publicly. She had not demanded money or recognition or sympathy. She had simply corrected a broken system the moment she saw it failing again. Same as before. Ethan looked toward the dark presentation screen behind them. Dead. Silent. Reflecting distorted fragments of chandelier light across its surface. You said the system followed you, he said quietly. Claire nodded. The architecture still uses parts of the original framework. The framework you built. The framework we built. Ethan stared at her carefully. And nobody told me. Would it have mattered? Ethan opened his mouth immediately, then stopped. Because 7 years ago, maybe it would not have. 7 years ago, he trusted boardrooms more than interns. Executives more than engineers. Confidence more than quiet intelligence. Richard suddenly checked his phone, expression tightening slightly. The media outside already knows something happened tonight. Ethan did not look at him. Good. Richard blinked. Excuse me. Ethan turned slowly now, billionaire composure returning in a different form entirely. Colder. Sharper. More dangerous than arrogance. Prepare the archived records. Ethan. All of them. Richard's jaw tightened. You are making a mistake. Ethan looked toward Claire once more before answering. No, his voice remained calm. I think the mistake happened 7 years ago. Another silence settled across the ballroom. Softer this time. Less hostile. More human. Claire felt something unfamiliar twist quietly inside her chest. Not victory. She had imagined this moment differently for years. Angrier maybe. More satisfying. But watching Ethan stand there with genuine regret in his eyes only made everything feel sadder somehow. Because she could finally see the truth clearly now. He had not destroyed her life out of cruelty. He destroyed it by never noticing it existed. By midnight, the storm over Manhattan had begun to slow. Rain still slid across the towering windows of the Marlowe Grand Hotel, but softer now, like the city itself was finally exhaling after holding its breath too long. The ballroom looked different than it had 3 hours earlier. Half the guests were gone. The orchestra had packed away their instruments quietly. Champagne glasses sat abandoned on marble tables beside untouched desserts and melted ice. Wealth always looked strange after silence entered the room. Claire Bennett stood near the service hallway with her coat folded over one arm, ready to leave without saying goodbye to anyone. That had been the plan from the beginning. Finish the shift. Stay invisible. Go home. But nothing about tonight had followed the plan. Near the stage, Ethan Calloway remained surrounded by legal advisors, engineers, and nervous executives speaking in low, urgent voices. Richard Vale had disappeared nearly 20 minutes ago after receiving a phone call he refused to answer publicly. Claire noticed Ethan watching the ballroom doors repeatedly now, searching for her between conversations. She should have left sooner. Miss Bennett. Claire closed her eyes briefly before turning around. Ethan approached slowly across the empty ballroom floor, no longer carrying the polished confidence that usually moved ahead of him like armor. His tie was loosened now, his suit jacket unbuttoned. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man who had not slept properly in years. You are leaving. Claire nodded once. My shift ended an hour ago. Ethan glanced around the nearly empty ballroom. I think everyone's did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Somewhere outside, a taxi horn echoed faintly through wet Manhattan streets below. Claire could smell rain drifting through the hotel entrance every time the revolving doors opened. Ethan finally looked at her carefully. I read the preliminary archive summary. Claire said nothing. You were telling the truth. The words came out quietly. Heavy. Claire lowered her eyes toward the marble floor. Not triumphant. Just tired. Ethan slipped one hand into his pocket and removed the old photograph again. He studied it for another moment before offering it back to her carefully. I kept trying to remember your face, he admitted. After I saw the picture. Claire accepted it silently. And I remembered the coffee first. She looked up slightly, confused. Ethan gave a faint, tired smile. You used to bring terrible vending machine coffee into the server room around 2 in the morning because everyone else forgot to eat. Claire stared at him in surprise. You remember that? Not enough. His smile faded quickly. That seems to be the problem. The ballroom lights reflected softly in his gray eyes now. No arrogance left. Only regret. Ethan glanced toward the dark presentation screen behind the stage. Do you know what scares me most? Claire waited quietly. The fact that I built an entire company around seeing vulnerabilities before anyone else did. He looked back at her slowly. And I completely missed the people standing right beside me. Claire felt something tighten painfully in her chest. Because the sadness in his voice sounded real. And real regret was harder to hate than cruelty. Ethan exhaled slowly. The board is going to fight me on reopening the investigation. Of course they are. But I am doing it anyway. Claire studied him carefully now. Why? Ethan looked genuinely surprised by the question. Because what happened to you was wrong. That is not usually enough for corporations. Ethan almost laughed at that. No, his eyes drifted toward the rain beyond the windows again. But maybe it should be. Silence settled between them again. Softer this time. Human. Claire adjusted the coat over her arm gently. You do not owe me anything, Ethan. Hearing his first name from her somehow affected him more than accusations had. Actually, he said quietly, I think I owe you almost everything. Claire shook her head immediately. No, you owe the truth honesty. That is different. Ethan looked at her for a long moment after that. Then, very softly, he asked, why did you never expose any of this before tonight? Claire glanced toward the dark skyline outside. Because I was tired. Her voice remained calm, but fragile now around the edges. Tired of fighting people with more money, more lawyers, more influence. Ethan listened silently. And honestly, Claire gave a faint, sad smile. Part of me thought maybe surviving quietly was enough. The words hit him hard. He could see it now with painful clarity. 7 years of rebuilding a life from scraps while the company that destroyed her became a global empire. 7 years serving dinners to men who discussed innovation without realizing the woman pouring their wine once helped build the systems they admired. Ethan looked ashamed, deeply ashamed. Claire. She met his eyes again. I am sorry. No speeches. No legal language. No billionaire polish. Just 3 quiet words spoken honestly beneath fading chandelier light. Claire stared at him for several seconds. Then she nodded once, because somehow she knew he meant it. Outside, the storm finally began breaking apart above Manhattan. Small openings appeared between the clouds, allowing scattered city light to shine through again. Ethan glanced toward the elevators where executives still waited nervously for his decisions. Then back at Claire. What happens now? Claire slipped the photograph back into her notebook carefully. Tomorrow morning, she said softly. People will wake up and pretend tonight surprised them. Ethan frowned slightly. And you? Claire adjusted her coat and stepped toward the ballroom exit. Tomorrow morning, she answered without turning around. I still have another shift at 4 o'clock. Ethan watched her walk away slowly across the marble floor while rain shimmered against the windows behind her. Calm, quiet, unnoticed by most of the world, but not by him anymore. And as the doors closed softly behind Claire Bennett, Ethan Calloway finally understood something success had never taught him. The loudest people in the room were rarely the ones holding everything together.